So welcome. I am delighted that this is the first of our Pause for Thoughts, and we have Lizzie with us to speak about such an important issue as grief. So welcome, Lizzie, and this is our first one. So we've got Lizzie's going to come up and give a half an hour talk, and then there's some time for questions. And then there's refreshments afterwards, tea and coffee and homemade cake. Thank you, Tamzin. If you want to remove your masks while you're seated, that's absolutely fine. And then if you, when we move around again, if you'd like to place it back on, that'd be marvellous. So let's no longer pause. Let's invite Lizzie up. Thank you.
Thank you. My water there. Thank you, Sky, and thank you, my dear friend Tam, who's here, who suggested this, I think, and I'm just so grateful to be here. Can you hear me all right? Is that okay? Good. So, I'm Lizzie Pickering. I'm a filmmaker and podcast producer and had a career in TV production before the rug was pulled from under my feet and I experienced traumatic grief for the first time. I've written a book. I finished a book in the last lockdown, and it's a book called When Grief Equals Love. And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to frame this evening's talk because the book isn't out yet. It's going to be published next spring 23. But this talk this evening has made me think about perspectives of grief. And I know there'll be so many of you here this evening who have been through grief yourselves, who are in the midst of going through it, or maybe who are supporting friends and family through grief. And I hope some of what I say resonates for you because I know that all our grief is so different. So the title of the book is When Grief Equals Love, but 21 years ago when I started writing it, I actually called it A Grief Endured. And so this talk this evening made me think about that. It made me think about the perspective of the fact that over 21 years since I went through my own traumatic grief, which was over the death of my son Harry at 6.5, that my perspective has changed. I was going to say dramatically, but it's not dramatically. It's been a very, very slow adaptation to living with my grief over my son. And so this title change from A Grief Endured to When Grief Equals Love is how that perspective has changed very, very slowly. And so I thought maybe this evening, and I'd love, I'll talk for a bit, but then I'd love us to chat together and for some of you to share some of your own experiences, which will be very different and unique. I thought maybe we could just look at how those perspectives have changed in 21 years and just what I've learned really in that time. And in the book starts with my diaries. So I'll tell you a bit about Harry in a minute, but he died at Helen and Douglas House in Oxford, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I just learnt so much really from the time of his diagnosis. But I didn't ever publish my writing. I started diary entries a month before Harry died, and I ended up writing for 7 years afterwards as I observed my children's grief, my young children grieving the death of their brother, and I observed my husband's grief, and I observed my own grief and how it changed over time. But it never felt right for it just to be our story. So in the last lockdown, 21 years on, I interviewed 23 other people about their perspectives on grief and how their grief had changed over time. And one of those friends is somebody whose son died 40 years ago, and she's now 80. So she shared with me what she's learnt over those years. And I hope that the book will help many people because it I think with these long-term perspectives, so many books are written in the early throes of grief, and they have helped me enormously at different times. Things like C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, I think, is one of the most beautiful accounts of grief I've ever read. And although I read it as a bereaved mother, one of the care team at Helen House gave it to me when Harry died. It doesn't always matter if it's a very different story you're reading, I think. It's still the same themes of grief that can come through for all of us, but in our unique ways. And I learnt that early on, that actually I found it helpful to read all sorts of accounts of grief and to investigate and to stay curious to it, so that I hope this book, when it comes out, will do that for other people, but not just through my words. So 21 years ago, Harry died, but I think my grief, and this might resonate for some of you, my grief started on his diagnosis. He was he was born healthily, and I'd had a very, very lucky, blissful life to that moment. I worked in TV production, and I'd had a very happy childhood. Not much had gone wrong until that moment. And then when Harry was 17 months old, a health visitor came to visit me I'd just had my younger son, Cam, and he was 6 weeks old. So she came for a routine checkup for Cam. And she picked Harry up, and she realised he wasn't weight-bearing properly on his legs. And she suggested we go to the JR for some checkups. And we had no suspicion at that point that there was anything wrong with Harry at all. I was a first-time mum. I didn't know what weight-bearing properly looked like. And he was crawling, and he was, a vigorous baby was what his health report had said. So that night, we went to the JR and had these routine tests, still weren't too worried. And a week later, we got a diagnosis which said he had a terminal, incurable, untreatable, and I wrote the 3 words down as they were given to us, and those were the words: condition, a type of muscular dystrophy called spinal muscular atrophy. So that is the moment my grief started, and it's when I really realised that a diagnosis can often be the start of grief for all of us, can't it? It's grief isn't just when someone dies. It can be that diagnosis where, in our case, the landscape changed ahead of us. We then didn't know what we were dealing with. Even our GP didn't know this condition. And that was our steep learning curve to learn how to live with this condition, how to love life again, and how to manage it, and how to deal with the 20 doctors and healthcare professionals that were sometimes dealing with Harry, how to try and stay being a family through all of that, and how to be full-time carers, and how work went just like that. We were suddenly on benefits. Everything in our life changed. And I suppose the first thing I wanted to do even then was read. I wanted to know, how do you survive grief? That was it. That's all I wanted to know, is how do we survive this? And how do we go forward? We did go forward, and as many of you will know, in living with a diagnosis like that, it's tough, isn't it? You live on a precipice, you try and enjoy every moment of your life, but yet it's always tinged with sadness. And it was in the early stages. I remember we started using Helen House for respite care, and it was Sister Frances, the founder of Helen House and of the Children's Hospice movement worldwide, who first told me the Gilbran quote, "The depth of your sorrow is the height of your joy." And that really resonated for me, because that felt like what our lives were like, that we were trying to give Harry the best life imaginable with this diagnosis on our horizon and living with it, but that was so tough, because everything was tinged, because we didn't ever know whether we were doing things for the last time or what each day held, let alone weeks ahead. But I was sort of struck at the time by a notion that we were actually living really well, because I was witnessing friends going about their normal lives, whatever normal is, but seemingly normal without the same issues to deal with. And I was very aware that everything we did had a sort of magical element because we were living, balancing life and death. And I now do a lot of work with grief guidance, one-to-one work with people, and people say to me, isn't it depressing doing that, working with death every day, especially during the last 2 years of COVID? And the answer is that, from the way I felt in those early days, of this desperate sadness, but also this awareness of the breath, of just breathing, being enough, being alive. I think, that's what I see, the courage in people dealing with grief and dealing with death is so incredible that it can make life seem more enhanced sometimes because you value life so much. And it's very hard to get to that point. And I think in the early days, I was only just aware of that. But now I feel it so strongly in witnessing other people going through it. So I think the first things I learned when Harry died, and we were very lucky having the support of Helen House because their grief guidance was absolutely incredible. Because at the time they had 30 years of witnessing families like ours. Interestingly, they didn't have grief counsellors or grief therapists who were trained. They had developed their own form of grief guidance, which was based on walking alongside the bereaved and witnessing what they really needed. And that's what I have taken on now, is that I've developed my own form of grief guidance. My USP is that I'm not a counsellor or a therapist. I've tried to develop something that is just through what I've learned from other people. I feel a bit like a sort of bereavement magpie who's picked up things as I've gone along. And the first thing that really shocked me when Harry died, and I don't know whether some of you have experienced the same thing, was the shock that it seemed to be down to me, the bereaved mother, and my husband being a bereaved father, to lead the way in our group of friends as to how we were dealt with. I know the thing I hear so often from the people I work with now, the bereaved, is they have all experienced somebody walking in the other direction when they see them, to avoid the difficult conversation because they don't know what to say. And I experienced that. I witnessed it in a supermarket in Chipping Norton, where a quite good friend literally walked the other way, and she didn't think I'd seen her, but I clocked the look of fear of having to confront me, the bereaved mother. And I have heard it over and over and over again from the bereaved people I work with, and it seems so terrible that it sums up our culture in a way in England around death, that we're so scared of it. We're so scared of saying the wrong thing that we say nothing. And there's this silence. And I think some of it does stem from the Second World War, where people coming back from the war, the government said, don't mention the war. It was it's a term we still hear, and we laugh about it almost, but it's so true. And people they were coming back to were told, don't ask any questions. And it right back then promoted this notion of don't speak about any of it. Let's have this silence because it's easier. And, I think most of us now know that silence is deadly. And it's the reason that so many people beyond the war, 30 years often, I don't know whether you've seen the film and read the book Railway Man. The film starred Colin Firth, but that film and the book were incredible. And that was 30 years after, in the 80s, that so many people were suffering from PTSD. Because that silence had caused it. Nobody had a safe place to share what they'd gone through. And nowadays, I also have people saying to me, I don't know what to say, I don't want to make someone cry. And, I see tears as being such a gift. Tears are a way of us releasing that trauma and that stress from our bodies. And it's so important. And I think in a way the ego of someone saying, I don't want to make them cry, you're not making the bereaved person cry. They are upset and devastated already and thinking about it every minute of every day of their lives. And what a joy to actually ask them how they're doing. I mean, not how are you? That's such a difficult question, isn't it? I think Jacinda Ardern said it so perfectly when, often people say to me, what should we say to somebody who's bereaved? And Jacinda Ardern, when she said, after the massacre, when she said in New Zealand, she said the gist of it was, we cannot know your pain, but we will walk alongside you every step of the way. That's all we need to do and say, isn't it? I think when we're walking alongside anyone who's bereaved, we can't fix it. There is no cure for grief. We cannot make it better, and people don't want to be made better. That was another thing that really shocked me when Harry died, and again I hear it over and over again. There's this notion of closure, isn't there, in a lot of therapy, and that we'll find closure on something. And also we're told from a young age that time heals. That was such an alien concept to me. And I soon realised that time didn't heal at all. And actually I found it harder. I found it harder to say, I haven't seen my eldest child for 6 weeks. And then 6 months was unbearable. And 6 years was intolerable, and now I'm 21 years on, and that is absolutely unthinkable that I haven't seen my child for 21 years. It is just, you cannot tell me that that gets better. But I have adapted to living with it, and I think that's what we can try and do, is adapt to living with our grief. And it is completely possible. I feel I have such a happy life these days, but it's taken a lot of work and a lot of addressing it and a lot of talking about it where I can in a safe space. And, again, it's finding the people you can talk about it with. I think I was very lucky that at Helen House I came to know other bereaved parents, and so I did have that safe space with them. And I think, when I work with people now and they're trying to go back to work after a major bereavement, one of the things they'll say is that in the workplace they feel very lonely, again because people aren't speaking to them about it and they don't know what to say. And with some clients, I've just said to them, is there anyone in your company that you think might have been through something, through grief? And one client knew of one girl in her big company whose father had died, and her father had died of COVID in the last 2 years, and she made contact with her, and it wasn't somebody she knew very well at all, but in the workplace she was able to make contact with her, and they've become really firm friends through their shared grief. And sometimes it is just finding one person. It doesn't have to be a large number of people. Finding one person that you can share safely your conversation with can be really, really helpful, I think. And there are all these wonderful platforms as well. There are things like the Good Grief Trust and Cruise Bereavement and the Compassionate Friends, and I don't know what you have on offer here, but there are really great ways of finding community, and I think that's one of the most helpful things is finding other people who you can share it with. So that was a big shock to find that time doesn't heal, but it wasn't a negative in a way, because now with more professional experience I now know about continuing bonds, and that was sort of the opposite of closure. So not finding closure, because how could I possibly want closure on my son? That's just not a thing. It was such an alien concept. But the notion of continuing bonds, and it's the basis of all my work now, is how do we, the bereaved, move into the new landscape that doesn't include the person we've loved physically there? But how do we bring them forward into our new life without them physically there? How do we bring forward the memories the things we want to remember. That can sometimes be complicated. I was working with somebody recently who had a terrible relationship all her life with her mother, who she still loved and still always wanted to be her mother, but it was very, very complicated. But she is not only grieving for the mother she had, but the mother she wanted and didn't have. And so there are a lot of complicated layers of grief, I think, and they're not always easy, and they're not always about having loved somebody easily. But yet I still think this notion of continuing bonds with her, we've looked at ways of bringing forward the memories that were special. There were some childhood memories that were very special to her when they did have good moments together. And we sometimes do that with photo books, and I get people writing and writing in a very unstructured way. So just, I think often in grief, memories come quite thick and fast, and then you can panic in this sort of, as the time goes on, you can panic that you're losing the memories and maybe losing the memory of the voice, and it's so helpful to write them down. And that's why I started writing, was just, just to remember. And then sometimes going and, I'm sure we all have photos that we can access, but often in a family they might be in one place, and not everyone wants to take photo albums apart or go through all the drives of digital photos now. But for each individual person in a family, sometimes doing their own writing of memories and then going to the photos wherever they are and finding the very special ones that were unique to them and their memories, or even taking a camera and going and photographing special places that were special to them, can be really useful. And, because some people don't have photographs, but they can still go and photograph a special place and access those memories. And I find it does seem to help people a lot, that when you're scared of losing those memories, to be able to write them down and use photographs or drawings, or even asking people in the family or old friends of the person to send their memories, is another really useful way of bringing the person back for you. And then by putting them in a book in some way, it's a really wonderful thing to be able to access it. And I think a lot of in grieving you can feel very out of control at times. I know in the early days after Harry died, I had terrible panic attacks, and they were often, and I call the early days the first 3 years, before I sort of adjusted and settled into this new way of being. And that timeline is different for everybody, obviously. But to be able to access the memories somewhere, it can help the panic. I used to have terrible panic attacks in supermarkets because I didn't know whether I could get to the paying to the till. If I was in a queue, I would start panicking because I was crying so much at the time that I could not control when I was going to cry or not. And so I'd panic because I thought if I was in the queue, I might not get to the till without uncontrollable tears happening. And so actually, I just thought, this is ridiculous. Just don't do that. Don't put yourself in that situation. Go with somebody, go with a friend, or go at a different time, or, I just had to change that. But by writing all these things down, it helped the panic, because I could go and access this book and access the writing and access the photos when I wanted to. So, for instance, as time went on, if I was working again and busy with work, you can again start to panic that you're not giving time to your grief. And by having somewhere to access it, that can be really, really useful. I think the other thing, if you're supporting somebody through grief, I was so grateful to people that checked in with me, who acknowledged that time, there's some people that think, oh, time heals, so it's a year now, you're getting better. And that wasn't the case at all, but you get less attention as time goes on. There's that sort of flurry at the beginning, and then as time goes on, you're living your normal life and you're probably presenting very well to the outside world when you feel up to it. And then people think you're okay. And I was so grateful to the people who knew the difference and checked in. And also who remembered birthdays and anniversaries. You know, I do quite a lot of work with a charity called the Good Grief Project, who fund bereavement retreats and run bereavement retreats for bereaved parents and siblings. And Jane and Jimmy, who set up the Good Grief Project, are bereaved parents. Their son died in an accident when he was 22. And they set up an idea with Josh's friends that his friends started sending postcards from around the world when they were travelling. And they're called Postcards from Josh. And they send the postcards almost as if they're writing to Josh or about Josh with their memories or what they're doing. And they send them to Jane and Jimmy. And it's such a beautiful idea. And they love it. It lifts their hearts to get these postcards. And they're now 10 years on in their grief for their son. But these friends of his are still remembering and still sending them and checking in. It's just beautiful. So it's the opposite of this fear of saying the wrong thing or not mentioning the name. In fact, they made a beautiful film, they're filmmakers as well, called Say Their Name. And it was for the compassionate friends. And again, it was people's fear of bringing up the name in case somebody cries. And, you know, I think all of us who are bereaved know that, yes, you might cry, but it's such a relief when somebody actually is brave enough to talk to you about it. And give you that safe space. So, what time is it? How are we doing? Oh, we're okay, aren't we? So, my personal grief toolkit, I don't know whether it's helpful to share that, but the things that have really helped me have been reading. Right away, you know, as I say, when Harry was diagnosed, but also after his death, I did want to read. I wanted to know, how do you survive grief? And actually, 21 years ago, there weren't so many books about grief around. There was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was sort of, you know, insightful on the stages of grief. But in those days, it was written as a linear thing. And I think now it's much more known that grief is non-linear. And it's messy, and it can hit us at different times, and we can recover a bit and then be set back. And I kind of like to think about it slightly as gears changing, and that even all these years on for me, I can move up the gears and be doing really well, but then suddenly the traffic slows down and I can be set back again, and then I move forward. And I'm always moving forward, but it's always with me. So reading about other people's perspectives on grief has been really helpful. And on my desk at home, I have, I don't know, probably 20 books on grief that I absolutely love and that I recommend to other people. One of them, actually one I found just 2 weeks ago, and it's called The Party is Dead by Erica Buest. And I'm just reading it at the moment. And it makes me laugh at myself when I find these books and, you know, this sort of dark side of reading about grief and death so much. But I get so much joy from listening to other people's perspectives. And this is somebody's journey when her father-in-law, who she absolutely adored, died a few years ago. She set upon a journey to go and explore grief in other cultures. And it's her journey through 7 death festivals in the world and observing how other people deal with grief. And I am really interested in the Mexican Day of the Dead, where, you know, you think of our silence here in England, and yet in Mexico, every year, the dead are welcomed back and they put out food and drink. And I didn't know that actually dead children are welcomed back the day before the dead adults. And there's a special sort of hosting and putting food and drink out for them. And I know that's so extreme to many of us, but actually what a wonderful thing to celebrate the dead and to give people a chance to talk and to have a day dedicated to them. I mean, you know, we do that as a family. We always do something different every year for Harry, and we ask each other what we'd like to do, and every year it has been different, whether it's been going on a picnic or whether it's just getting together informally, going to the grave, whatever it is. But we talk about it and we work out what we want to do, and sometimes it's included 30 people of Harry's friends and tribe, and other times it's just been us as a family. But it's just good to talk about it and to honour them and to have a space to do that. Other things for me that have really helped, I find I learned a lot about the physical stages of grief, and it shocked me how physical grief was. And I don't know whether, you know, many of you have experienced that. I had pneumonia for 4 years on and off after Harry died. It just kept coming back and it couldn't be treated. And, you know, I look back now and I think, well, that was just grief. As my grief changed and I adapted around it, I stopped getting pneumonia. And I think it's so ironic, isn't it, that when somebody dies, we stop breathing. We hold our breath. And I've tried all sorts of different therapies. I've had hypnotherapy to help with sleep, because often we stop sleeping when someone dies. I had cranial sacrotherapy, which is a physical therapy, where 16 years after Harry died, the therapist said, "When did you stop breathing properly?" And I said, "Oh, maybe when my son died." And yoga has helped me a lot, again, to try and breathe properly, to live in the moment. I work very hard at that because it helps me to stay grounded and to cope better. But I always found in doing yoga that I couldn't breathe properly into the top of my lungs, and I put it down to the pneumonia, and just accepted that that was part of my life now. And when I went to have this therapy, this physical therapy, she said, "No, I don't think that's pneumonia, because pneumonia would be at the bottom of your lungs, the scarring. This is close to your heart." Surprise, surprise. And she helped me to start breathing properly again. But that was 16 years on, because I hadn't realised that I had this legacy of not breathing properly. I just thought I put it down to the physical side, but actually it all linked back to the whole heart. I spoke to a cardiologist recently who has just stopped doing cardiology. She's a surgeon, to make documentaries, because she feels she'll be more effective getting the message out to more people about heartbreak. Because she says when she sees a lot of people with heart issues, they don't always show up on scans, because heartbreak doesn't show up on a scan in the same way. But it's a real thing. And as a cardiologist and a medic, she wants to make more change to looking at what we can do with our mental and emotional side around heart issues than just the pure surgery. So it was fascinating talking to her, because I felt that for a long time. I see so many clients with quite severe physical effects. The gut, it's no surprise that the heart and the gut are affected, and yet GPs put people on omeprazole for gut problems without asking about grief, for instance, or what's happening in other areas of their lives. And I also, what's been interesting is now doing talks on grief. I do a lot of talks to companies in helping people to try get back to work and have more understanding in the workplace. And I was finding after the grief talks that a lot of people were coming forward for one-to-one grief work who'd gone through divorce. And so I now really, in those talks, talk about death, diagnosis, divorce, and workplace change, because they are all major, major losses of that landscape ahead, and major changes in people's lives. And people are just not given enough support always. So really trying to change the conversation in the workplace around what grief is and how people grieve. Meditation has helped me enormously as well. And lastly, fundraising is a wonderful thing. I think fundraising's interesting. When Harry died, a lot of people, I went to work for Helen House, the Children's Hospice, for 12 years after Harry died, so I learned enormously from that experience. And a lot of people would always fundraise when somebody died, and often for Helen Douglas House. And I think what fundraising gives anybody is the chance to translate their grief and the chance to have a sort of honouring around fundraising. So whether somebody's died of leukemia or Parkinson's or cancer, whatever it is, it's a really good chance to, even before the death of somebody, to fundraise and to draw the community around them, to make friends and family feel less helpless, because we can all feel like we can't help, but yet where there's fundraising we can all do something. And it gives a family a chance to educate maybe about the condition, about how they're feeling. So for years after Harry died, friends would fundraise for Helen House, and often around his anniversary. And if we communicated about it, it gave us the chance to say, this is how we're all doing now, this is where we're at, you know, and it was just a chance to draw the community around Harry again. And that has carried on. And so not only is a charity benefiting, but also it's a chance to translate your grief or to translate how you're feeling, and that's been a really positive thing. So I often try and get people fundraising as well, just because it's a really, really positive win-win situation in a way for everybody, I think. And finally, I'd love to just leave you with an Einstein quote that I heard fairly recently, and again it really resonated, and it was that adversity introduces you to the real you. And I think that is so true. I think, you know, when I walk beside bereaved people in my work now, I just have never witnessed such courage. When I worked at Helen House for 12 years, I never witnessed such courage. I believe in the strength of human spirit and human nature. And when people are going through grief and illness and dying, in some ways it's not the most depressing thing in the world. It's unbearably sad for all concerned. But I think we all find some strength there and some resilience, and we can surprise ourselves with how we can do that. And it's a slow, painful process. But in a way, that quote, adversity introduces you to the real you, it really does, because only we can know what our grief is like. Nobody can cure us, but only we can start to just take little incremental steps forward in opening up and just learning to live with it. And it's possible to have a happy life and live with grief, I think. So I hope some of that's resonated for you this evening. And thank you all for coming. Does anybody want to join in and have anything to share or any questions?
I can certainly relate to the grief starting with a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Because we had a diagnosis 17 years ago, and that's a sort of cloud.
Yes.
For a long time.
Yeah. And did you all deal with that very differently, Tam? Because you know, it's interesting in a family, isn't it? How we can't all move at the same pace, can we?
Yes, I think it was sort of up and down for yes, and we weren't all at the same space at the same time. But it did make us actually realise that life's so precious, and we started doing things that we had been putting on hold. Because we said, well, we can't afford that, or we better not book that holiday because, you know, we might get some work. And then when we got the diagnosis, we said, well, forget all that, we're going to do this.
Yeah.
And we went hitchhiking around America. So
amazing.
Yeah.
And those trips that you do when you're in that state of learning to live with a new horizon are so Oh my goodness, they're just so loaded, aren't they, with absolute joy. And again, that depth of your sorrow is the height of your joy. I don't know whether you found this, but over the years, that quote resonated for me when Harry was diagnosed in the way you describe. And I thought of the depths being here and the height of joy being there, and that they were quite far apart and polar opposites. Whereas now, 21 years on, I would say they balance each other and they live alongside each other, but that's been a long time, and maybe that's why the title of the book only came to me in 2021, in the spring, you know, all those years later, from being a grief endured to when grief equals love, because I do think grief equals love. I think if we can change our perspective and think the amount of pain we're in is because we loved somebody so much, or something, or a marriage that was very precious, but for whatever reason it's broken down. But it represented love, and if we can find a place to live with that love and change the pain to love, or our perspective on it, then that's really helpful. And I think that, but it's taken me such a long time to get to that. It's not instant, is it? It's, you know, but nor would you want it to be, because we have to suffer the pain to represent love for any of those things. Hi, Al.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah. Beautiful speech and talk. I've just got 3 quick points. I was widowed very young, and the organisation that helped me enormously was Way, which is Widowed and Young. So I strongly recommend that to anyone. If you know got your friends or family that are in that situation, then by all means check out the Way Foundation, because they were fantastic at offering help and support. Secondly, I agree with Lizzie. I think you mentioned 3 or 4 different types of grief, and I have to say, having already lost my wife, when I lost my job, the physical effects of that were as great, if not greater. The illness I suffered as a result of losing my job was probably greater than what I experienced when I lost my wife. That might be partly due to the fact that I had young children at the time, so obviously a lot of my attention was focused on them. But that's, you know, it's another form of grief. It really is. It really impacts on you physically. And the third thing is another thing that helped me was that, you know, these people, you know, that often die unexpectedly, or you know, I mean, all death is horrible, but you know, early death is very tragic, and but a way of sort of dealing with that is, for me, was to think, well, they lost their life tragically at a young age. They didn't choose to lose their life, and so we owe it to them really to live our lives and to try and fulfill our lives, because otherwise you'll just, you know, they didn't choose to die, but if you just give in and do the same, you know, mentally, just die inside, that's not really helping anyone, and you owe it to them and they would want you to live your life and have a full and productive life.
True.
So,
oh, Al, thank you. And you know, it's thanks to you. Our sons knew each other when they were young, didn't they? They became friends, so we met. And I actually send quite a lot of my clients to Widowed and Young as a result of knowing about it through you, Al. So your impact of us sharing that years ago has meant that I now recommend people in that category to go.
Yeah.
You know, that's why it's so useful, the sharing, and why the silence of the past generations is so hard, because the more we bond and meet other bereaved people, the more we can share the information, and the more we can help other people to get through it and to learn to adapt to it with us. I don't know whether any of you have read Dr. Edith Eger's work. She is just my absolute inspiration. She's 94 now, and she's a Holocaust survivor. And in her 90s, she has written 2 books, one called The Gift and one called The Choice. And she believes we have a choice to live, as Al said, to make the most of what we have. But it's hard to get there. And she says that in her 90s still, she is working very hard on her own grief. and her marriage nearly broke down, a long time after the Holocaust. Her parents both died in Auschwitz, and she and her sister left Auschwitz as survivors. And she still lives with it every single day, but she lives a really happy life. She has a big family, she has grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and she's a survivor, and she thrives. But she still works on it all the time. And when her marriage nearly broke down, she was blaming her husband a lot for all sorts of things, and then she realised that it was her issue and she hadn't addressed her grief properly, and she went back to Auschwitz and looked her grief in the face and did more work, and she says she still has to combat it every day, and yet she's leading this incredible life. There's a Netflix documentary being made about her at the moment, but she is an absolute inspiration, and her books have helped me again just in the last 2 years since I've discovered them, and renewed my appetite for this work and for sharing and, just learning. I think we have to stay curious to everything, don't we, if we can? And that's the difficulty in grief, is often we can close down very easily and naturally. And we do for a while, we hibernate. I did. But it takes, you have to find the courage to sort of start just in very small steps, moving forward, I think, and being true to yourself, whatever that involves. Thank you, Al. And Al, I think what you described there is cumulative grief. The fact that your work change impacted so massively, but you'd already been through your wife's death. I think what I see in the workplace a lot is that we don't know always what people have been through, or in any community. And so a lot of people really fear their animals dying, and people could get competitive about that. People say to me, you've been through the worst thing anyone could go through, your child dying. It's not. It's my worst thing that I've been through. But for somebody else, it could be their dog dying. Or it could be their grandfather, and they don't get enough support because people think, well, he was elderly and that's the right order of things, so they'll be okay. But that grandfather might have been the person that brought them up and had been their mainstay, just as someone's dog could be having a terrible life on so many levels, but the dog has been the one living thing that has been their rock. And and so we can't judge other people's grief. So I think there's that thing where we mustn't judge other people's grief, but also cumulative grief, where we don't always know what's come before or gone before, and then we're just looking at one instance, but actually that workplace change or divorce, could come to somebody who was bereaved early in their life. Maybe a parent died, but in the workplace or in a community, we don't know that. And so they might have an enormous reaction to something that seems more minor, but actually it's the accumulation of many other forms of grief going behind it.
How long did you hibernate for?
I don't know. I think I felt I was hibernating. Probably to the outside world, I didn't look like I was, because I had a 2 and a 5-year-old. And so I did still have to, do the school run and deal with their grief and their confusion and their bewilderment. And so I had to get up for them. So I think to the outside world, I probably looked like I was functioning. Jane at the Good Grief Project, this is pre-COVID, she always used to say, we're high-performance mask wearers. And of course that has a new meaning now, but she used that expression. She's a psychotherapist as well as a bereaved mother. And we often do talks together, and I love that expression, because I think we can all present to the outside world as being okay, but inside I was hibernating. And I don't know how long for. I'm maybe 3 years. And everyone, why is it that people think you get to a year and you must be all right? What is that about? Or whatever the time scale is, they think you should be all right. Maybe you've been through all the hurdles of the first birthday and anniversary and all these things, and then you suppose... I had one client who's wonderful Nigerian lady, and she said she had this sort of really high-powered job in London in an ad agency, and she said in Nigeria, culturally, in her community, you were taught that you grieve for 75 days, and then that's it. That grief ends at 70, or your mourning ends at 75 days, and she was months into her grief over her father and was so bereft. But she really genuinely couldn't understand why she'd grown up being taught this and nothing had eased. And it's interesting, isn't it? Another friend who's from Sudan, he was out moving animals in the Sudan. They lived on a mountainside. It's a really, really simple, beautiful way of life, but challenging. And he was away, he's 30 now. He was moving animals, and his father had a cut to his leg, and because they had no medicine and no doctors or access to anything, he had sepsis, and he died very quickly while Ishmael was moving the animals. And so he came back, and his father had died, and because in his culture they're buried immediately. The elders of the village, the family dig the grave, the elders wrap the body, and then the body is buried and the ritual happens, but within 24 hours. So by the time he came back from moving animals, his dad, who had just had a simple cut to the leg, had died. And Ishmael is struggling massively a few years on with his grief, because he's still in traumatic shock, I think, from that, but that was their cultural way. But he missed it because it was so quick, and there are so many ways, aren't there? And I think we can take bits from all of these different cultural things and take what suits us in how we come to terms with it.
Certainly physically it makes you very tired, I found.
Yes. Yeah.
And also my legs keep giving way.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is quite new.
Yes. And the trouble is our heads can try and talk us into, our minds can try and chatter and talk us into being okay, can't they? And sort of, but your body actually is telling the truth quite often, isn't it? Which is that you do need to hibernate and take it easy and be aware. But it's hard to be able to say to people as time goes on that I had one young client in her 20s, and her father had died, and she had a very busy job, and at work she'd had it was the anniversary, and she'd fallen apart completely, understandably. It was the first year, and she hadn't told anyone at work. She was so scared of losing her job if they thought she wasn't up to it because of grief. And so she hadn't been able to tell anybody. She'd said she'd got a sore throat and taken to bed for the day. And that seems so terrible to me, that we have to be worried about losing jobs when we're in grief. And, again, that's what I'm trying to do in companies, is help them to understand what it's like, and that it's not just the first year, and it's not a matter of having counselling for 6 weeks and then never mentioning it again, but they can support staff really well. So quite a lot of companies I work with now are giving staff the option of a day off as a bereavement day, and they can choose any day of the year to take it, but it's not leave, and it's a day that they're given when they go through a major bereavement. And I think I know it's only a day, but it's something that you're being given to honour yourself in a way, and to be given that time. And it means just that offer of one day means so much to people, because it's recognising something. And I think even when people just recognise your grief, that's it chips away at it, doesn't it? And it helps you feel supported. But yeah, well, thank you so much for coming this evening, especially on a Sunday evening. Thank you, Sky. And I think there's cake, isn't there? Tamsin's brought cake.